Now comes a very sensitive topic, and we posted on Facebook this afternoon. It might be a topic that we might feel like is almost borderline blasphemous. Finding disappointment in God. And just hear what I have to say, and I'll let you judge whether it's blasphemous or not. In 2010, I had, out of the many friends at Faulkner, I had two close friends. And, college experiences really do change and challenge the way you think. And at times, they really bring your faith to a test. And I remember these two men, these two individuals. One was later a groomsman in my wedding, and the other I still keep in contact with, even though so many years have passed. Both of their mothers were stricken with cancer. One, the mother had much more advanced cancer, and the other one, they were positive that she had cancer, but they were going to take her in for a second opinion. But the outlook was not good. And I remember we, one night, gathered our two social clubs. One was in one group, one was in the other group, kind of the Faulkner's version of a fraternity. And we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but in the end, we were brothers in Christ, and we had two brothers in need. We gathered in a room that seated about 70, and there were about 80 to 100 there. And for an hour, we implored God in His wisdom, in His mercy, if He could, if He was willing, not that He was unable to, but if it was, we implored His compassion. And we asked Him if He would allow these two women to be healed. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my life to see these men just come together, between 18 and 22, and just pray for these two women. Within 2 months, one of the mothers was considered completely healed. She had completely been in remission. In fact, if I remember correctly, it was not even cancer. It was something else that they thought had become cancer. So she wasn't even in remission. She was healed. The other mother passed away. And I remember in that moment, in being a 20-year-old who was a Bible major, being disappointed with God. It was a very honest, very real experience that I share with you. That even though you can have the faith of a giant, one event can cause you to shrink and cower. And when you think about certain moments in your life, you can perhaps understand what I was going through. And I think we go through them time to time, despite what we've been taught and despite what we even hold to believe, that there are still occasions where we feel disappointed with God. The idea of disappointment, the understanding of being disappointed, the term itself means the feeling of sadness or displeasure caused by the non-fulfillment of one's hopes or expectations. And I think if we're honest with ourselves again, I think we can agree that there have been times where we have had moments of disappointment, even with God, where we feel like we had certain expectations and God did not deliver. We were trusting, we were faithful, we were loyal, we were submissive, we were humble. Yet in the end, God hasn't or did not deliver. I think about Elijah. I think about what we've read so far. Elijah, he did everything right. He stayed close to God, even when the entire nation turned away from God. For 3.5 years, this man, he waited out the drought. He trusted in God at the brook of Cherith. He trusted in God with the widow at Zarephath. He trusted in God as he appeared before Ahab. He showed courage. He showed boldness. He had patience. He waited. He bided his time. He followed through. He never gave in. He never gave up for 3.5 years. And God, at that point, it seemed like God had delivered with this fire from heaven. But then disappointment began to set in for Elijah, when he realized not even fire from heaven can change the hearts of some men. So I want us to spend just a few moments talking about disappointment. If we have moments where we feel disappointed with God, does that make us a sinner? Does that make God powerless? Should we give up on God because we're disappointed? Perhaps by studying Elijah's life, especially in this moment, we can better understand not only the grief that men and women go through, but the compassion and love that our Father has for us, even when we feel disappointed in Him. So let's look together in 1 Kings 19, and let's read about this man at the lowest point in his life. And dare we say it, better understand when we are disappointed with God. Let's begin together. In 1 Kings 19, beginning at verse 1, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." As we begin hearing the honesty of this man, we see this man on the run. You think again that Elijah couldn't get at any higher of a point than he was now. Again, he was so loyal, he was so faithful, he waited, he was patient. And then he came before Ahab, and in this flourish, fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, proving once and for all that the Lord was God. And all of the prophets of Baal were destroyed, and all the prophets of Asherah were destroyed. And God even, we didn't cover this part, God even brought rain back down on the earth. Wouldn't you just feel such a victory at that point? And then you read verse 1 of chapter 19. So Ahab told Jezebel everything that had happened. And Jezebel began to write a letter, and she sent this letter to Elijah, saying, "May the gods do worse to me than what you did to my prophets if you are not like them this time tomorrow." Now let me ask you a question. Why did Jezebel send a letter? Elijah was in the vicinity of where she was. She could have had a plot to assassinate him, to kill him. But she sent a letter, and you know why I think that is? To cause him to run. To stir doubt in his mind. She was playing a mind game. It's possible that she didn't believe that she could have him killed. But she was very successful, very cunning at what she did. And I want you to think about how Elijah went from faith to fear. It's amazing when we read verse 3. After all we've read about Elijah to this point, Elijah's almost been kind of stoic, except for the part where he prayed on behalf of this child who had died, the son who had died, and then later when he was reprimanding these prophets. Otherwise, every time God told him to do something, Elijah did it without question. But now, he was afraid. We never read of his fear when he appeared before Ahab. We never read of his fear when he was in hiding. We never read of his fear when this child died. We never read of his fear when he went against these prophets, hundreds of prophets. But here and now, because of the letter of one person, Elijah was afraid. And I wish I had thought about it ahead of time, but I wish I had put a map. If you just follow the laser point, imagine this A being where Elijah was. He ran all the way down as far as he could to Beersheba, and he dropped his servant off there. And then he ran as much as he could, and none of this, there weren't cities right here. This was all wilderness. This was all desert. Elijah ran more than 100 miles south. Then he dropped off his servant. And then he just ran as much as he could into the wilderness. But here's what's really interesting. For the first time in the account of Elijah's life, Elijah acts without God's discretion. God did not tell him to run. God didn't tell him to flee. Elijah allowed his fear to overcome his reasoning, and he acted without God. Then something ironic happens after he crawls underneath this tree. He asked that he might die. Now, if he wanted to die, why didn't he just stay where he was? Jezebel said she was going to kill him. He was giving up. He was tired of it all. He couldn't handle it anymore. He was on the run. And I want you to notice as we begin to try to understand grief, something that I absolutely love about what Scripture reveals to us, not in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament. We read in James chapter 5, verse 17, Elijah was a man who had a nature like ours. He was just like us. We often idolize, we often put these Bible characters on a pedestal, and we really we don't understand what they went through. And maybe we kind of gloss over, but Elijah was just like us. And here at this point, he was suffering. He was suffering with grief. He was suffering, frankly, with depression. See, we see some symptoms of depression. First of all, he isolated himself. He went to a place where not even his servant was, his closest friend was. He left him, and he went away by himself a full day's journey. The second thing we notice concerning this depression is a self-centeredness. And I want you to understand, I'm not saying people who go through depression are just self-centered in the fact that all they can do is brag about themselves, but rather it's the opposite. All they can do is think, this is it for me. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing left. My life is worthless. As a matter of fact, that's a third symptom of what we see with depression. He began to neglect his own worth. He said, I am no better than my fathers. Just kill me already. God, I'm done. Here we see Elijah's disappointment begin to be revealed. And might I suggest to you, Elijah was running because he believed that after the rain came again, victory was going to be at hand. Yet when victory not only did not come, but in fact hardship came doublefold, that's when he began to feel disappointed. It may not be that God has disappointed us so much as it is our expectations of God have disappointed us. We expect God to do certain things. We expect God to work on our timetable. We expect God to do what we want Him to do. We expect God to think how we think and to act how we would act in the situation without realizing that He is omnipotent, without realizing that He is a creator, that He is so much more wise, so far beyond the finite way of thinking, that He has a much greater plan in store. So maybe it's not that God has disappointed us as much as our expectations have disappointed us. God never told Elijah that once it rains, everything was going to be okay. That's what Elijah thought. So here we have this man, and he's cowering under a broom tree, asking to die. How does God react? We continue reading. We read about this God who decided to respond. As he lay down and slept under a broom tree, behold, an angel touched him and said, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there at his head a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water, and he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, What are you doing, Elijah? What are you doing here? He said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel, forsaking your covenant, throw down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and even I only am left. And they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces and the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after a fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, What are you doing here, Elijah? I want us to think about how God acted in response to Elijah's disappointment. First, God heard Elijah. And you may think, well, of course God heard him. How could he have not heard him? I want to remind you in 1 Kings 18, how when the prophets of Baal leaped and danced and cut themselves and blood flowed, no one paid attention. But when Elijah cried out and said, God, show them who you are, God answered that day, and God answered Elijah now. Even when Elijah was disappointed in God and even questioned God and demanded God to do something to kill him once and for all, God heard Elijah even in Elijah's anger. The second thing that God did was God strengthened Elijah. He sent a messenger to go and give Elijah strength. He fed Elijah. Now we know that based on 2 loaves of bread, you couldn't make a 40-day journey. So God spiritually strengthened him. You know what's amazing about that is the angel said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. What that tells me is that God understands my frailty. He understands my weakness. He understands my humanness. He understands what I can do and what I can't do. So when God tells Elijah to do something, he already knows if Elijah can handle it or not. So when Elijah went and hid underneath this tree and said, It's enough, God knew it wasn't enough yet. He knew Elijah's heart. And I think about the psalm in Psalm 103, how the Lord knows who we are. He remembers our frame. He knows that we are dust. Then we see the God who encouraged Elijah. God began after Elijah makes it to this mountain. We could spend a whole series talking about the Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And how when Elijah gets there, God said, Well, what do you want, Elijah? What's on your mind? And Elijah begins to pout and begins to complain. We'll talk about that more in just a minute because Elijah does it again in verse 14. But God was encouraging Elijah. Elijah, tell me what's on your mind. What kind of God have you ever read about in human history who implored a man to say, What do you think? What are you doing here? God encouraged Elijah to speak his mind, even though God already knew Elijah's mind. God already knew why Elijah was there. Then God reminded Elijah of who God was. He sent forth this wind, and it shook the mountain. And then he sent forth this earthquake, and it shook the mountain. And then he sent forth this fire, which is very reminiscent of what just happened the previous chapter. And the fires, and the earthquake, and the winds also reminisce the days of Moses, when Moses was on Mount Sinai with God. But God not only reminded Elijah of those 3 things, He also gave him this bread. Remember how God fed Elijah by the brook. Remember how God fed Elijah through the widow. God took time to remind Elijah who Elijah was and who God was. But what's most spectacular is not the wind, not the earthquake, not the fire itself, but the whisper, the low voice. despite having this inexhaustible strength and power, God approached Elijah with a soft whisper. God was gentle with Elijah, even when he could have been strong and powerful. And I think as I try to learn from what God is doing, I realize that I, as a human, I can be so obtuse. I can be so incredulous. I can be so self-centered that I forget who I am serving. I forget who I am and who He is. And sometimes God has to remind me. Yet even though God reminds me, He still comes to me with gentleness and mercy and patience. And He's asking me what I'm doing. What did Elijah do to deserve the number of appearances God gave to him? Furthermore, what have I done to deserve an unlimited amount of appearances before the throne of God in prayer? Nothing. God has offered me prayer. God has encouraged me. God has asked for me to boldly come to Him before His throne in prayer. This is how God responded to Elijah. Well, let's look at how the man decided to complain. I don't know if you ever seen the 90s show Seinfeld, but one particular episode, one of the characters creates an alternative holiday. And in the holiday, he has an event called the airing of grievances, where once a year you sit before your family and you say, I got to tell you all the problems I have with you people. That might be a little healthy. We probably shouldn't do that. But I think about that. I think about the airing of grievances with what Elijah does to God. Let's bring it down to brass tacks. God gives Elijah an opportunity to express his frustration. Once again, when Elijah hears a voice, once again God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars. They've killed your prophets with a sword. And I, even only I, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. I want you to hear what Elijah's saying. First he said, look at me. Look, I've been following you all these days. The idea of jealous is the understanding of very zealous, very passionate. He holds only to God and he forsakes all other gods. He's very dedicated, very devoted to God. He said, look at me, God. Look at who I am. Look who I've tried to be. Look at them. You see what they've done? They haven't been like me. They've forsaken your covenant. They've abandoned you, God. Not only have they abandoned you, they've torn down places to worship you. Not only have they abandoned you, torn down places to worship you, but they've killed your special prophets. The voice mouth of God, they've slaughtered. He says, look at yourself, God. I'm the only one left who follows you. Out of your great covenant with David, I'm the only one that's left. And they're about to kill me. God, what are you thinking? Where's your plan? You're supposed to be almighty. But now the last one of your people is going to die. I think about his frustration. And I think, frankly, it might be healthy for us in times of crisis to verbally express our struggles. One reason, because we may not fully understand what we're struggling with until we actually express it. The second thing I think that's healthy about airing our grievances is that we realize how small they are in God's grand scheme. We talked about that this morning with peace. You know, that there are things that I struggled with 5 years ago that I thought would be the end of the world. I don't even remember them now. And Elijah, I believe at the end of his life, which we'll talk about next week, would say the same. But you know, his words remind me of another individual. And we'll close with the last point after we talk about this individual. Does Elijah's frustration sound familiar? Because to me it sounds somewhat like the older brother in Luke 15. Do you remember when the older brother, he's out working in the field, he's doing his job. He hears celebration. What's going on? Well, your younger brother, the one who took all your father's inheritance that your father gave him, he took about a third, more than likely a third, of all of your father's wealth, and he squandered it. You remember all these rumors we heard about him? Well, he's home. And your father just killed the best calf that he had. And they're having a party. Come on, join us. The older brother, he sat out on the porch. He wouldn't go inside. He was so mad. Father came out. What's wrong? The older brother said, I'm the faithful worker. Look at me. Look what I've done. I'm faithful to you. Look at what he's done. He squandered the inheritance that you gave him. You're a lazy, wicked son. Look at who he is. Then look at yourself. I've never had a small calf. I never had a goat to celebrate with my friends. But as soon as a son of yours came back, you throw him a big party. We very well might be the older brother when we're disappointed with God. Because the older brother didn't have the right perspective. Self-centered. Let's close with how God reacted. Let's talk about the God who showed compassion. I don't know how God has the patience that He has for me. I can't imagine. I really can't imagine being in His position. And a disciple of mine came to me with these kind of complaints, seeing only one piece of a very large puzzle. But after Elijah bore his frustration, which he did without sinning, by the way, he approached God, by the way, with reverence. If you notice, he took a cloak and wrapped it around his face, and he stood at the entrance, and he simply answered God what was on his mind. You know what God did? God showed him compassion. God gives him some final commands. He says, well, first, go on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat, and Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the ones who escape from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. I want you to notice the first command God gives is rise, get up. I'm not done with you yet. Again, Elijah said, it's enough. God said, not yet. I still have work for you to do. It's okay for us to be honest with God and express our frustration. It's not okay for us to give up on God and to give up being His servant. God said, I want you to go first. I want you to anoint this Gentile to be a Gentile king over this Gentile kingdom. Why? God had a plan. God is not just the God of the Israelite nation. God is the God of all nations. God uses every nation for His glory, for the good. Not only for him, but for those who love the Lord. God had a plan for this man who was going to be king. Then God said, I want you to let Ahab know it's over. I want you to know that Jehu's about to become king. Jehu wouldn't be the best king. God had a plan for him. Then God began to show this compassion. He said, you know what, Elijah, your time's over. I want you to go take a prophet. I want you to take this man and make him the new prophet. We're going to spend a lot of time next week talking about training those who are going to continue our work when we are gone. But he said, Elijah, it's time for you to make a new leader for my kingdom. And notice what they were going to do. They were going to eradicate the sinfulness of this kingdom. First with Hazael, then Jehu, and then Elisha. But catch verse 18. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. You know, Elijah said multiple times, even I alone, am left. Yet Elijah wasn't alone. Elijah, as a matter of fact, if you go back to 1 Kings 18, he learned about a man named Obadiah. And Obadiah had been faithful to God since his youth. And then Obadiah was so faithful, although he was not willing to stand up to the king, God used him to save 100 prophets from the wrath of Jezebel. But God said, you don't even know everything. I have 7,000 people loyal to me, which to us may not be a lot in the midst of 1 million or more being wicked. But Elijah wasn't alone. Some thoughts on disappointment. The lesson is yours. First, when we're disappointed with God, perhaps, just perhaps, it's not that we're disappointed with God. We're disappointed in our expectation of God. Second, when we think about disappointment, we need to remember that God has always been there for His people. He has always responded. He's always welcomed us to answer. Third, when we talk to God about our disappointment in prayer, we very well might need to have a better perspective in life. Much like the older brother, all he could think about was himself and not about his father receiving a son who he thought was dead. And then finally, when we're disappointed with God, we need to realize that God has a bigger plan than any one of us can imagine. And we are so far from being alone. We need to realize that we are working the fields together. And the moment we begin isolating ourselves from God's work is the moment we will begin to feel disappointed with Him. You and I serve the same God. We serve the same purpose. And even when we go through struggles and life's difficulties, we do not have to go through them alone. Finding God in a failing world, realize that even though at times we may feel disappointed with God, He is not done with us. He has work for us to do, and at the end of our lives, He will call us home. Don't you want to go and be where God is? If you're not a child of God, understand that by being baptized into Christ, God will call you home. He will welcome you into His arms, much like the Father welcomed the prodigal son home. If you're a child of God and you've been struggling with disappointment, whatever the case might be, realize God is here to listen to you. We are here to pray for you. And He will call you home when the work is done. If you need anything at all tonight, do not hesitate. Come now while we stand and while we sing.